So last week we ended on a really high note. David defeated Goliath. Just an awesome turning point in David's life. He's kind of at the peak right now of his career, so to speak. But everything is about to change. If you'll remember, we were reading a few weeks ago that Saul greatly loved David. Well, this is where that's about to change. After David won the battle with Goliath, he still continued to gain favor with Saul, to the point that Saul actually ended up putting him over all the men of war. The Bible says essentially he made David his general, the leader of the entire military force. In 1 Samuel 18, verse 5, it says, "And David went out and was successful wherever Saul sent him, so that Saul set him over the men of war. And this was good in the sight of all the people, and also in the sight of Saul's servants." So David just kept rising. Everything seems to be on this great track and this great trajectory for David. But then this one little thing happened that kind of changed everything. So verse 6. "As they were coming home, when David returned from striking down the Philistine, the women came out of all the cities of Israel, singing and dancing to meet King Saul, with tambourines, with songs of joy, with musical instruments. And the women sang to one another as they celebrated, 'Saul has struck down his thousands, and David his 10,000s. This was the moment where all the love that Saul had for David went out the window, right here in this moment. Up to this point, he thought David was the greatest thing since sliced bread. But when he came home and he heard those women singing, "Saul has killed his thousands and David his 10,000s, that was the beginning of the end of their relationship right there. Verse 8, "And Saul was very angry, and this saying displeased him." That is an understatement. He said, "They have ascribed to David 10,000s, and to me they have ascribed thousands, and what more can he have but the kingdom?" And Saul eyed David from that day on. So this was the beginning of the end. And you're going to see this in Saul's personality and in this story. But what is hilarious is they're not actually saying anything that's false. Saul sat in the tent for 40 days and would not go out and fight Goliath. The whole victory was because David had the backbone to go out and fight him. You did sit in the tent, Saul. At least they ascribed to you thousands. They could have said, hundreds, because you didn't really do anything. David did everything. But it doesn't matter that that's the facts. It doesn't matter that that's the reality. He's jealous of David now. And from that day forward, the Bible says he had his eyes on David, and not in a good way. So the first big point that I want to make here is, remember, all of this is orchestrated by God. Saul has already been rejected by God for several years at this point. What's happening is inevitable. The kingdom is slipping away from Saul, and it's slowly being put in the hands of David. This whole process is happening. It's, as I've said before in this series, this is an issue between Saul and God. This is not an issue between Saul and David, but Saul is making it an issue between him and David. He's directing his anger, he's directing his hatred at David. Is this David's fault? No. God's rejected Saul. God has selected David. What Saul should be doing is going to God and repenting, saying, "I'm so sorry that I caused this. I'm so sorry that I've been rejected. God, what do you have for me next?" Maybe God would work with him and find that place for Saul. But no, he's turning all of his anger, he's directing it all towards David. And that's what jealousy does. And that's what's really happening here is jealousy begins to creep in. And jealousy is an extremely powerful sin that begins to come into Saul's life, and it actually turns into hatred, and it causes him to hate David, to begin to detest the sight of David. And it really almost causes Saul to begin to lose his mind. He's so ate up with jealousy. He's so ate up, he becomes super paranoid, super angry, super vengeful, making erratic decisions, erratic choices. It's all because he's ate up with jealousy. If you think about jealousy and what jealousy is, it's really misplaced hatred. You start to hate the person that has what you can't have. You start to hate the person that has what you think you should have, or what you think you deserve. You start to blame the person that has what you can't have. You start to blame them for your situation. Your problem is with them. They're the reason why you can't have what you want. What's the reality though? What is the reality of this situation? Saul is 100% to blame for his own situation. The situation that he's in was not even the will of God. I want to read to you again what God spoke to Saul through the prophet Samuel, all the way back in 1 Samuel 13. It says, "And Samuel said to Saul, 'You have done foolishly. You have not kept the command of the Lord your God with which he commanded you. For then the Lord would have established your kingdom over Israel forever.'" That was the will of God, that Saul would have reigned over Israel forever. His sons and the generations after him. He said God would have if you'd obeyed God, God would have established your kingdom forever, and you wouldn't be having all these problems with David. Now, that would seem like bad news to David, but the reality is, if Saul had done what he was supposed to do, David would have never even been selected. We wouldn't even be reading about King David. We wouldn't be doing a life group series on King David. We'd be doing one on King Saul, and about how he followed God and he obeyed God. God made it clear through Samuel. He said, if you obeyed God, God would have established your kingdom forever. So whose fault is it that that kingdom was not established? It's Saul's. But he doesn't see it like that. He starts to hate David. He starts to blame David for all of his problems. And so through that jealousy and through that hatred, the relationship begins to deteriorate. If you remember, this is exactly what happened with Cain and Abel. God warned Cain. He didn't get what he wanted. He became jealous of his brother. What happened? He ends up murdering his brother. Was it Abel's fault? Of course not. It was all Cain's fault. God even warned him before it happened. He told him what to do, how to fix it. Didn't matter. He hated Abel. And this is how jealousy works, and we should be aware of this in our own lives. Whenever we start finding ourselves being annoyed with someone, detesting someone, not liking someone, be good to step back and ask why. Because a lot of times what's at the root is jealousy, and it has no place in the heart of a believer because it can develop into something much greater than that. And with King Saul, it did develop into something much greater. And so in verse 10, it says, "The next day a harmful spirit from God rushed upon Saul. He raved within his house while David was playing the lyre as he did day by day. Saul had his spear in his hand, and Saul hurled the spear, for he thought, 'I will pin David to the wall,' but David evaded him twice." So apparently he had two spears nearby. And good thing David was quick and nimble and a man of war, and he was able to evade two spear throws at David. So, look, regardless of the fact that he missed, he was trying to murder David. This was attempted murder. He tried to kill David right there in his throne room. This is how far and how quick that jealousy had advanced. If you'll notice the reading of it, Saul had just appointed David general of his army a couple days ago. He hears the song, and by the next day he's hurling spears at him. So this deteriorated very fast. All right, and we don't have time to get into all of the details of the story. You can go back and read it. But over the next few weeks and months, Saul attempts to kill David multiple times. He actually throws spears at him again. He puts him on the front lines of the battle. He puts him in dangerous situations to hopefully he'll get killed in battle. He attempts to kill him multiple times. He gets to the point that he is so angry with David that he actually ends up killing anybody associated with David that tries to help David in any form or capacity, including his own son Jonathan. He even ends up throwing a spear at Jonathan, his son, because he believed that Jonathan was trying to help him. Now, he didn't kill Jonathan, but he attempted to in a moment of rage and anger. This is how bad it got. Now, as we finish up this week, I want you to pay very close attention to how David responded to all of this. Because the whole point of this series, and what you're really going to get throughout this whole series, is an understanding of the process of God and how God tests his leaders. And one of the areas that David is being tested in this moment is how do you handle leadership? How do you handle a leader who is over you? How do you submit to authority? How do you honor authority? How do you honor authority that is borderline crazy and making awful decisions and even trying to murder you? How do you handle that? And David is being tested in that. But listen, remember, don't forget this. God had him in that situation on purpose. God had him under a lunatic King Saul for a reason. It was because he was trying to work something out in David. And so the area he's being tested in now is, how are you going to handle King Saul, a fallen King Saul that's losing his mind? How are you going to handle it? Are you going to quit? Are you going to talk bad about him? Are you going to gossip? Are you going to become offended? What are you going to do? And how David handled this is one of the reasons that he ended up being qualified to be king. Let me just say this. None of us will ever experience working under a leader like King Saul. None of us. Okay? It will never be that bad for any of us. But we live in an age right now that is offended about everything. Offended about everything. You can post anything online. If you have enough followers on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, whatever, you could post anything and someone's going to be offended. You could say clouds are white and somebody's going to say that's racist. Somebody's going to be offended about everything. It doesn't matter what you say. It doesn't matter how pure. We live in an age right now that's just offended by everything. Well, that translates into leadership. I'm preaching, I say something, didn't intend it that way. Somebody's going to be offended constantly. But this is one thing that's being tested in David, is his ability to follow leadership that he doesn't necessarily agree with. I would say not necessarily, like a lot doesn't agree with. He's throwing spears at him. He doesn't agree with King. He knows that Saul's been rejected by God, but he's still following him. Why? Because it's about this relationship here. It's about his relationship with God, and he hasn't been released by God yet. So he stays, and he follows Saul as long as he possibly can until God releases him. Why is God doing this? Why is this so important to God? Well, I'll tell you one reason. Because there's no way you can be a good leader until you first become a good follower. And God's working that out in David through this process. And some people have the mindset, most people I think have the mindset of, well, no, I'll submit and I'll follow and I'll be on board as long as I agree with what they're doing. But of course, if I disagree with something they're doing, I can't follow that any longer. Well, I love what John Bevere says on this. He says submission doesn't even begin until there's a disagreement. I mean, if there's not a disagreement or there's not some kind of conflict, then there's no need for submission. If you agree, you're not submitting. If you agree, you're walking in step together. No, it's when there is a disagreement. It's when there is a conflict. It's when there are feelings hurt that the submission becomes necessary to go, you know what? I'm staying where God put me. I'm going to pray about it. I'm going to stay on task. That's when you're really tested in that area. But again, I'll say this, none of us are going to be tested like David was tested. And you may read this and you may think, man, after that first spear was thrown, I'd have been out of there. But you know what? If David had done that, he would have short-circuited what God was trying to do in his life. Now, by no means, if people are throwing spears at you, you probably should leave. I'm not recommending staying, through some maniac. I'm not recommending staying under somebody that's, treating you like that. What I am recommending, though, is being spirit-led. People make bad decisions just because, well, they said this or they did that. Look, just pray. Just pray about it. Just be spirit-led and do whatever God tells you to do. And I'll tell you this, He's not always going to tell you to do the easy thing. He's not always going to tell you to do the thing that your flesh most wants to do. Sometimes you have to, by following God and being led by the Spirit, you're going to be asked to do something that's really difficult. But it's going to shape you and it's going to prepare you for what God has, as it did with David.